Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is TURAN Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! Last week, the 5 heads of state of Central Asia traveled to Washington for a meeting with President Donald Trump under the C5+1 format. The summit was first launched 10 years ago by the Obama administration and then convened again in 2023 under Joe Biden. This year's meeting concluded with several agreements. Uzbekistan pledged to purchase American goods and services worth $100 billion over the next 10 years in aviation, infrastructure, agriculture, and information technology. A deal praised by Trump. Kazakhstan signed 30 agreements worth $17.2 billion and finalized over $1 billion in investment for U.S. companies to develop its tungsten deposits. It also agreed to join the Abraham Accords, the U.S.-brokered initiative aimed at normalizing relations between Israel and Muslim-majority states, although Kazakhstan has long maintained diplomatic relations with Israel. Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan received commitments for greater U.S. support in development and security cooperation. Importantly, the summit signals renewed U.S. interest in the region, which has sought to pursue a multi-vector foreign policy to diversify partnerships beyond China and Russia. With President Trump in the White House, a leader who is unlikely to press these governments on human rights or democratic backsliding, Central Asian leaders found space to emphasize economic cooperation and mutually beneficial deals. In this episode, we focus on U.S.-Central Asian relations through the perspective of a diplomat who dedicated his career to the region, Daniel Rosenblum. Now retired, he served as U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan from 2022 to 2025 and to Uzbekistan from 2019 to 2022. Prior to that, he coordinated U.S. foreign assistance programs in the post-Soviet region. We had a fascinating talk right before President Trump met the 5 Central Asian leaders. Hope you will enjoy it as much as I did. A quick note before we start. We had a few technical issues, so the audio drops in quality here and there. Still, I would really encourage you to stick around till the end. It's absolutely worth it. Welcome to TURAN Talks. Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
Hello, Agnieszka. It's nice to talk to you today. I'm glad to be here.
So there is a lot I would like to discuss with you today, especially because today President Trump is meeting the 5 Central Asian leaders in the United States. So a very exciting day. But before we move to U.S. relations with Central Asia today, I would like to ask you about your past, because your career spans, 3 decades? I mean, your work in Central Asia, in fact, and you first arrived in the region in the 90s. So can you tell us what country did you visit first, and what was your impression of the region, and what was the region like in the 1990s?
Yeah, so you're right. I've been coming to the region for actually almost, I hate to say it, almost 4 decades now. It seems, starting actually in the late 80s. But I have been, engaged deeply with Central Asia for about the past 3 decades, as you said. And my first visit was in 1992, and it was to Kazakhstan. And I should just give a little bit of context here about why I went to Kazakhstan when I did. I wasn't yet working for the State Department. I was not a diplomat. I was working for a non-governmental organization called the Free Trade Union Institute, which was affiliated with our labor federation, the AFL-CIO. And I had been hired by them to start building ties with labor unions in the Soviet Union. Actually, when I started, it was still the Soviet Union because I started there in 1991 before the breakup. So we were building up relationships between American labor and post-Soviet labor. Primarily, initially, it was the coal miners. For those who know the history of this time a little bit, you may recall that the coal miners were striking in 1990, 1991, 1992. They were a very militant worker organization going on. And in fact, to some extent, I think it was the coal miner strikes that brought about the fall of Gorbachev and the rise of Yeltsin, because Yeltsin allied himself with these unions. They had political demands as well as economic demands. And their political demands were essentially they wanted more democracy and more, I guess you might say, modern or Western relations between labor and management. So anyway, I was there for that purpose, and one of our main contacts in Kazakhstan. Yeah. So I was to be clear, I wasn't living there. I was visiting. I was still based in Washington. But I went there at the invitation of the coal miners of Karaganda. Karaganda still today, has a lot of coal mining, but it was much bigger in the 1990s. It was a center of, industry in Soviet Kazakhstan. And the miners organized for me a chance to meet some other emerging unions in Karaganda Oblast. And there was a union of, I think it was civil servants, essentially, local government workers. And I remember very clearly going to my first traditional feast. This was the so-called Dastan where a sheep is slaughtered and served to the guests. And I'd never seen anything like it. It was quite eye-opening for me as a young novice in the region. And what really sticks in my mind is that when they parceled out the sheep to the guests, I got to eat the ear of the sheep because I was the youngest at the table, and the youngest eats the ear because you're supposed to listen to your elders. It's kind of a symbolic, thing about listening to those who are wiser than you. And so I ate the ear. I have to say a little reluctantly. It's not the most delicious thing I've ever had. It was very chewy and hard to get down, but I did. But I took away from that encounter that there's something different in this part of the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet that nothing prepared me for. There are these traditions and this culture that's very different. And, for the previous decade or so, I had been studying Russian history, Soviet history, studying the region as a student, as a graduate student. And I really knew next to nothing about Central Asia and its culture and how different it was. And so that was a revelation to me, that first visit.
Those experiences in the 1990s in the region, did they kind of set you on the path to continuing your career in the region in the 2000s and later?
Well, yes. I think my path to working in the region was set earlier, in fact, because I was fascinated by the region from childhood, actually. So it wasn't just what happened in the 90s. I should just say very briefly that I'll give you the short version. My interest in the region started because my father was a scientist at NASA, but also a human rights activist who was involved in trying to help the Jews of the Soviet Union back in the 1960s and 70s. And so as I grew up, I was surrounded by this kind of focus on what was happening during the Cold War in the Soviet Union. So I think that set me on the path that would, lead me to stay in the region. But certainly what happened in the 90s, when I worked for the AFL-CIO and traveled all around the region, was instrumental in not only keeping me interested and committed to working the region, but also to learning what was going on. And I have to say that those years, I was much closer to the people because, I was traveling on my own. I was meeting with labor union activists and workers in various parts of Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan. And so that formative period really gave me a feel for what life was like for people during this transition, this post-communist transition.
In the early 2000s, you started working in the area of U.S. foreign aid, right? Also in the region, and you witnessed quite a few interesting events in interesting moments in the region's history. So maybe you would like to share with us a memory that stuck with you from this time, maybe like an event that shaped the region, because there were quite a few of them in the beginning of the 2000s.
In terms of the events of the early 2000s, I think I would be remiss if I didn't start with 9/11, because it really changed a lot in terms of our U.S. focus and policy, and especially in Central Asia. As you pointed out, at that point, I was working on U.S. foreign assistance in an office that oversaw all of U.S. foreign aid to the post-Soviet countries. And my job was focused on former Soviet republics. And I would say before 9/11, the emphasis was very heavily on what we call the transition. So it was trying to help countries make the transition to democracy and market economies. And there was this belief, of course, and this goes back to some of your listeners will recall the Francis Fukuyama's infamous article, The End of History, in the early 90s, which, this idea that liberal democracy and market economics was the ultimate form of human organization and had won. And it was just a matter of getting everyone to that point. And a lot of our programs in the 1990s, the foreign assistance programs, were aimed at that. 9/11 happens, and suddenly I think that there was a realization that there is some basic stability and security that's necessary before you can worry about transitions and, evolutions to democracy and free markets. So in Central Asia, we at that point, and I remember very clearly, within days of the attack on 9/11, we were already reorienting our programming to focus heavily on Central Asia. And I think that, the foreign assistance budgets for Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, especially, the countries bordering on Afghanistan, doubled, tripled, quadrupled overnight. And we were doing a lot of things that we had not previously been focused on, especially related to defense and security. So that's one beginning of the 2000s events that I remember. And I think that focus continued for the next 20 years, really, as long as we had our troops in Afghanistan. That was an important part of U.S. foreign policy. There were lots of other things that happened in those years.
A revolution in Kyrgyzstan, for example, 2005 and then 10.
That's right. Yeah. So this was a period that, I guess you could call the early color revolutions. That was when the term color revolution came into use. And I recall very well the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then I think they called it the Tulip Revolution initially in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And after each one of these events, we put together very large packages of foreign assistance to try to help new governments to recover, restructure, and reform. And again, the overriding idea here was that the trajectory should be towards being more democratic and having more open market-oriented economies. And that was that was sort of the built-in assumption behind much of our foreign assistance programming in those years. And I can remember, traveling to each of those countries I just mentioned, Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan, and, talking to local governments and talking to our embassy and trying to figure out what made the most sense in terms of our assistance programs. And, I think looking back on it now, we were perhaps a bit naive, or not, not anticipating how these changes could go wrong or turn in the wrong direction. And I think of Kyrgyzstan between 2005 and 2010, when the next upheaval took place. And, it was really a descent into a tremendously unstable and corrupt situation. And unfortunately, we were heavily invested in trying to make it better, and it was not going well. I actually have much clearer memories of the 2010 uprising, because in that case, I spent a lot more time in Kyrgyzstan afterwards. And I was there not only, right after the overthrow of Bakiyev, and especially his son, Maxim Bakiyev, who was very, very unpopular and was the target of a lot of the protests. But also several months later, you had the ethnic violence that broke out in the south, in Osh and Jalalabad, and it created a lot of extra work as we were trying to help, stabilize and get them back on the track of reform.
I wonder, how do you see the relations between the US and Uzbekistan? Because in that time, obviously, the changes in the relationship were quite significant. So from the US military base in Uzbekistan, set up to aid the logistics of the Afghan war, to basically the removal of not only US but also Western organizations and diplomats and journalists from Uzbekistan after the Andijan massacre.
I was very aware of the deterioration of U.S.-Uzbek relations after Andijan, because again, at that time, I was the coordinator of U.S. assistance to the region, and the assistance was heavily affected, as some may recall, right after the Andijan incident. Some might call it a massacre, others an uprising. The U.S. was critical of the way the Uzbek government handled it, and President Karimov reacted very badly to that. And essentially, not only were we forced out of the base at Karshi Hanabat, although that was beginning to happen even before Andijan, so that was not directly tied to it, but our assistance programs were essentially shut down. All the NGOs that were implementing them were forced out of the country. They were deregistered and basically asked to leave. And our diplomatic presence was reduced. We were forced to send home some diplomats, and basically we were unable to provide any of the assistance anymore under the conditions that were created. And then there was, it was about a decade after that where the relationship was kind of rocky. It wasn't, we still talked to the Uzbek government. There was still formal dialogues between the two countries, but there was a lot of tension around issues of human rights and democracy, especially. And I would say that the only reason why the relationship remained, manageable, or still continued at some level, was because of Afghanistan. We still had a very strong need for help from the Uzbeks to get supplies into the country. There was a lot going by rail from Termez down to Mazar-e Sharif, and we needed their help. And they also, to be balanced here, I mean, Uzbekistan wanted the U.S. To be in Afghanistan. I think they saw us as a stabilizing presence there at the time. So there was a reason for a relationship, but it was a often tense and not very fruitful relationship, I would say, for about a decade. And towards the end of Karimov's life, I think things started to improve somewhat. I'm not sure exactly what was going on within the Uzbek government, but I think there was a understanding that the United States was an important partner and maybe they needed to improve the relationship. At the time that I became ambassador, it was just a couple of years after Karimov had passed away, right? So he died in late 2016. And by the way, I'll just share a quick story about that. I happened to be in the region when Karimov died. I was in Kyrgyzstan. At that time, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia, so I traveled to the region often. And I remember getting a call. I was on the steps of the parliament of Kyrgyzstan, having just had a meeting there. And I get a call from the Uzbek ambassador in Washington, who I had a relationship with. And he called to give me the latest news about the health of President Karimov. And he was obviously reading from some talking points that he had been given, like a script. And it basically said, the president is in serious condition, but, the doctors are taking care of him, and we're hopeful that he will recover soon. Something to that effect. I later learned that, in fact, he was probably dead already at that point. There was a lot of, later there was all sorts of debate about when he actually died as opposed to when it was announced. But it was interesting to me that the government thought it was so important to manage the, international reaction and to sort of control information that they had the Uzbek ambassador calling me while I was in Bishkek to read me this message. But anyway, within a day after that, I got the news that President Karimov was dead, and there was going to be a funeral, and then other ceremonies. And I called our ambassador in Tashkent, Pamela Spratlin, who is a good friend and longtime colleague, and I said, Pamela, should I try to come to Tashkent for the funeral or for anything? And she said, look, don't come for the funeral. It's all very confused. Things are kind of a mess. You'll just add to the confusion. But if you can wait a couple of days and come later, I think it would actually be good for somebody from Washington to be here. So that's what I did. I rearranged my travel plans, and I showed up. I guess it was probably about 3 days after Karimov's funeral. And I got meetings with the foreign minister, Abdulaziz Kamilov. I got meeting with the president of the Senate, Sadiq Safayev, who was a former ambassador to Washington. Actually, Kamilov was also former ambassador to Washington, so I knew both of them. And of course, I expressed my condolences on the passing of the president. And it was very interesting at the time to hear what their message. Their message was, first of all, we need the United States. We need you as a partner. We need you because of Afghanistan. We need you because it helps us balance with our neighbors, the sort of influence with our neighbors. And we think there's a chance to sort of turn over a new leaf in the relationship. And I remember specifically Foreign Minister Kamilov telling me that he thought the biggest priority should be improving relations with the neighbors, with the Central Asian neighbors, because Karimov notoriously had bad relations with his neighbors. I won't go into all the details, and I think many of your listeners already know, but, the relationship, especially with the Tajiks and the Kyrgyz, was just terrible. And the borders were, like mines. They had landmines. It was really a bad situation. So I could see already something new was emerging here. And by the time, I came back a month or two later and met with President Mirziyoyev, together with a senior State Department official, it was very clear to me that there was a new dawn in Uzbekistan's relations with the region and with the United States, frankly. So anyway, just to finish up, when I got there 2 years later in 2019, that new relationship, that new dawn was well established already. And my job was to kind of keep it going and keep the momentum going in the right direction.
That's actually super interesting. So when you eventually came to Tashkent, was it because you already had some pre-existing relations with, let's say, Uzbekistan's elite? Is that the reason why you were chosen for this position, or what was it, there some other reason?
Yeah. So actually, I should say that my being chosen as ambassador was a little bit unexpected from the standpoint of the State Department, and I'll tell you why. Because I was not, of course, I'm retired now, so I have to use the past tense. But I was not a foreign service officer. Most of our ambassadors are either political appointees, that are friends of the president or campaign contributors to the president, or the majority of them in the past have been foreign service officers who spent their whole career traveling around the world, working at different embassies, and occasionally in Washington, but mostly overseas. I was a civil servant. I was a State Department civil servant, which is a smaller number of people who tend to be experts on a particular subject. They're lawyers, they're financial experts, or they're regional experts. Now, I was hired at State initially as a regional expert, an expert on the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union. And so I spent my career in Washington, not at embassies, and traveling quite a bit out to the region, but not based at an embassy. So when I was chosen as ambassador for Uzbekistan, it was a little outside the box. There are very few civil service ambassadors around the world. Usually there's only maybe 2 or 3 of them. And I was lucky enough to be one of them. The reason to your question about why was I chosen? It had a lot to do with my experience in the region. My contacts as well. I think that played a part. I like I said, I knew Kamilov, I knew Sklayev, I knew these people, and I had equivalent partners in other countries in the region. So it was a combination of background, experience, and contacts. But again, it was a little unexpected to people because I was not a foreign service officer.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. What was the most challenging during your time as an ambassador to Uzbekistan? Because obviously it was a country that was willing to implement a number of reforms, but not all of the reforms were possible to implement, which we know, for example, when it comes to freedom of speech or when it comes to democratic changes, like political changes, not much has changed. So what was the most challenging for you as an ambassador and as a representative of the United States in that time?
The human rights portfolio, the human rights agenda was challenging. Although I will say that what made it somewhat less challenging was the openness of the Uzbek authorities to discuss any issue and to often try to address it, although, sometimes incompletely address it. So, and that was a change from earlier years, as we were talking earlier about the situation before Mirziyoyev became president. Then we would have dialogues with the Uzbeks about human rights, but it was like a, conversation of 2 deaf people not really hearing each other. And I think when I was ambassador, neither of us were deaf anymore. We were hearing each other very well. It didn't mean that they always did everything that we asked them to do, or that they were responsive to all the things we raised regarding freedom of speech, regarding political prisoners, regarding democratic institutions. But it was a real dialogue, and there were real efforts made on both sides to come to an agreement, I would say. There were some situations where, things were maybe more difficult, I would say. I can recall one incident involving an Uzbek journalist who was essentially arrested and kidnapped in Kyrgyzstan. when he was in Kyrgyzstan. I don't know if you were there when this happened.
Yeah, Babamurad Abdullayev.
Yes, yeah, probably. And then he was extradited back to Uzbekistan. And it was, it was so at odds with everything that President Mirziyoyev had been talking about, promising to change in terms of the relationship with the media and the treatment of journalists. And it was a glaring case. And we had a couple of options, a couple of paths to take in that case. We chose to take the path of private, quiet diplomacy, rather than, making tweets and statements. And I think in that case, it was effective. And I remember, multiple conversations around that with the foreign minister and other senior government officials and basically my message was, this is not good for Uzbekistan's international reputation. And it so clearly, violates international obligations that you have signed up to and that you talk about respecting. And it's going to set back the image of your country considerably, even though it's just one person and one incident, but sometimes that can be, very powerful in terms of what it says about a country. So anyway, I don't know whether I have no idea if it was the U.S. messaging going on and my diplomatic intervention or other things. There were lots of other people speaking out. So, it was not only us. But in the end, when he came back to Uzbekistan, this journalist, or very soon thereafter, he was released. He was sort of under, I think there was a little sort of period of essentially house arrest, I think. And then eventually that ended. And I actually remember the journalist coming to meet with me in my residence because we wanted to send the message that, we're watching, we're paying attention to this. And because we knew obviously he was being followed, he was being watched. And we had a discussion about what had happened to him. He went through an account of everything that had happened in Bishkek and his return and so on. So that was one of the more challenging moments, I would say, but it was far from the only such moment. And I would say if I go towards the end of my tenure, the most challenging period of all, was Afghanistan in 2021.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that because, sorry to interrupt, but I remember that in spring 2021, there were actually rumors that US would open a new military base in Uzbekistan. I think it was published in one of the big US newspapers. And then immediately, Uzbeks denied it. I was always wondering what was behind this. I mean, where did this rumor come from? And were there any negotiations about the military base in Uzbekistan?
In a word, no.
Okay.
There were no discussions about a military base. And I actually think that some of it came from Russian disinformation, because I can recall at the time that there were articles in some of the Russian web-based news sources in Central Asia that alleged that the U.S. was planning to open a new base in Uzbekistan. We had seen that sort of thing before. It wasn't brand new, but it was noticeable that right around that period in 2021, as things were getting bad in Afghanistan for the Ghani government, that these stories started appearing, and there was no basis to them. I will say that we were always talking to the Uzbeks, and maybe even more intensely than usual while our military was in Afghanistan. In other words, we had an ongoing dialogue with them about the security situation in Afghanistan, about how they could be helpful to us, primarily with, facilitating the movement of goods into the country to support our military operation. And at the same time, we had very close, very productive military to military cooperation. We had joint training between some of our soldiers, special forces kinds of training, for example. We exchanged information. We exchanged data about, again, what terrorist groups were doing and what was happening inside Afghanistan. So there was a lot of cooperation, but that cooperation never got even close to the idea of, we want to open up a new base in Uzbekistan. That was never on the agenda.
So let's move to the removal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. I'm sure that it was a super stressful situation for you as an ambassador. Can you maybe tell us what was it like for you at the time and how involved you were in the whole process? Because it was a massive logistical operation.
Yeah. So first of all, I will say that with respect to the evacuation of personnel from Kabul and from Afghanistan, in that phase, as Kabul was falling to the Taliban and things were, the body government was falling, that we and Tashkent had no role in any of that. In other words, we were not part of the planning or part of the execution of any of that evacuation. People were not being taken out through Termez or through Tashkent. And it was our colleagues in DOD, our colleagues in CIA, our colleagues in Embassy, State Department, who did Afghanistan, who did all of that. So we had no role. However, I will say that after the evacuation, that after the Taliban took over and we finished that somewhat chaotic, but actually incredibly successful when you think of the numbers of people who were brought out, operation, we started getting drawn in, I would say, sort of pulled in to the situation. And here's why. So after that initial evacuation, Taliban were firmly in control. There were lots of Afghans who wanted to get out, as is well known, right? So there were especially people who had helped America over the years, who had been involved with our DOD efforts, our military efforts, or our civilian efforts, translators and people who had fought with our side by side with our military, and et cetera. There were lots of people who wanted to get out, and there were lots of Americans outside of Afghanistan who wanted to help them. And it was very difficult to get out for, a variety of reasons. I think Pakistan had closed its border. There were no flights anymore. The airport was shut down. It was very difficult to get out. So a number of these people, Americans, and these are some within the U.S. government and many outside the U.S. government, started contacting our embassy with lots of requests for help, bringing people through Uzbekistan. In other words, over the border into Uzbekistan. Because if you look at the map, and don't understand the relationships or anything, but just look at the geography, it makes a lot of sense. So why not just, have people crossing, especially if they're coming from the northern part of Afghanistan, Mazar-e Sharif and the northern part, have them come over the border into Uzbekistan. So in that period, there's like maybe a 2-month period, 6 weeks, let's say, after the Taliban consolidated their control, we were being besieged by these requests. And unfortunately, we couldn't help. We really couldn't respond because the government of Uzbekistan had made very clear that they were not welcoming any refugees or anyone crossing that border from Afghanistan. And they had their reasons for doing that, and I'm not going to second guess. Obviously, they were concerned about creating instability in the border area. They didn't want to get drawn into something that would bring them into conflict with the new Taliban government. There were a variety of reasons why they decided to do that, but the result was that we were constantly saying no to people. No, you can't do this. No, we can't help you. There was one group of American citizens who needed to get out, and the Uzbek government was actually helpful in that case, very helpful, and we were able to evacuate over that border a group of, I don't know, it might have been 20 or 30 people. I can't remember the size, but it wasn't that big. But otherwise, we basically were saying no to a lot of people, and it didn't feel good. It didn't feel, make me comfortable, but that's what we had to do. And then the other thing that happened during this period that was extremely challenging and created a lot of tension was the decision by the Afghan Air Force and a number of pilots and other Air Force personnel to essentially fly their planes out of Afghanistan and land them in Central Asia. And I think, again, people who follow the region will probably remember this incident.
Yeah.
So there were, I think, something like, I want to say 50 or 60 Afghan Air Force aircraft landed in Uzbekistan, and I believe near Termez, uninvited by the Uzbek government, and I would say unwelcome initially. But they let them land. And then for many, many months after that, we were dealing with the consequences of this, I would say, brave decision by a lot of Afghan pilots. And eventually all those pilots were evacuated from Uzbekistan, and eventually, I think almost all of them ended up in the United States, getting special visas as refugees, and were resettled in the U.S. And the aircraft itself, then there was a long period where we negotiated with the government of Uzbekistan. Those aircraft have now been essentially transferred to the possession of Uzbekistan for their air force.
I think that the Taliban have recently requested to receive those the aircraft back. Is it correct? I think there was news like that a month ago.
Really? Okay. To be honest, I missed that one. They have repeatedly over time, the Taliban government, requested or demanded the return of the aircraft. And I think the response has consistently been, well, first, initially it was the aircraft don't belong to us because legally they were still they belong to the United States. Now that they've been transferred to the government of Uzbekistan, I'm sure the government of Uzbekistan does not want to give them up. So I don't know what the response is these days from the government, but I imagine the Taliban will continue making that demand and being rebuffed.
Well, now to be honest, I got a little bit nostalgic because these were the last moments of my time in Uzbekistan. I also traveled to Afghanistan when the Taliban took over, and I also have a small anecdote from the Friendship Bridge, actually, because I when I was going back to Uzbekistan after reporting in Afghanistan, a border guard in Termez told me that he can't let me in because I don't have a ticket out of Uzbekistan. I told him, well, I live in Uzbekistan. He said, well, I'm sorry, I can't let anyone in who doesn't have a fly out. So basically, I was standing in the middle of the Friendship Bridge trying to get some reception and buying a ticket to Poland to visit my family, out of the blue. So that was actually a pretty funny story. That was a really, I think, exciting, interesting period in the history of the region.
It was, absolutely. And by the way, you reminded me of another Friendship Bridge story, which I experienced. And this was before the Taliban takeover and all that followed. Way before. This was probably in 2019 or 2020. So my first year in Tashkent, I took a trip down to Termez, and one of the things I did was spend time on the river. We actually went out on this river boat on the Amu Darya, it was a boat that had been given by the United States to Uzbekistan's border guards for their use in patrolling the river. And we also walked across the bridge halfway. We went up to the halfway point. And what was really interesting to me was just to kind of see the historical continuity here. The guy who was leading our tour was the then head of the border guards of Uzbekistan. And I'm sorry, I don't, my names, now escape me that I used to know very well when I was living in Tashkent. So the guy who was then the head of the border guards, and he was a military veteran of long standing. He was had been in the Soviet army, and he remembered, being this part of the Soviet army as they retreated over the Friendship Bridge after leaving Afghanistan in 1989. And so, it's like institutional or kind of historical memory of that relationship that is still, I guess, driving people's attitudes about security between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. It's very fascinating to me that people still remember these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would like to ask you so many questions, but unfortunately, the time is coming to an end slowly. And I have to ask you about the upcoming summit. Has it already started?
Yes, I believe it's happening today. And to be honest, I think that maybe it's the actual meeting is at 2 o'clock and it's only 10 a.m. here now. So it's maybe another 4 hours or so before it starts. There, a lot of preliminary stuff has already happened, other meetings and so on. But yes, the summit is coming up soon.
By the time this episode is published, the summit will be over. But maybe we can talk a little bit about what hopes do you have for this summit, or what are the U.S. interests in Central Asia? What does the U.S. hope to achieve during this meeting?
I, of course, now I'm out of government, so not, as directly involved as I once was in such meetings. However, I think that the reasons to have the summit and the hoped for outcomes haven't changed all that much from what they were in the years that I was involved. And by the way, this is, I think, you may know this is the 10th anniversary of this C5+1, which was this format that we started during the Obama administration in 2015. And the first meeting happened in Samarkand, and I was there with Secretary of State John Kerry. And 10 years later, I think the format's usefulness has proven itself, and of course it's been copied. I will say that we were not the first ones to set up such a format. It was the Japanese did it first, maybe a decade before we did in the early 2000s. South Korea followed, and then the EU followed that. So the EU has been doing it longer than the United States, but I think when we started ours in 2015, it started a kind of arms race of C5+1s. Everyone had to have it. So the Russians, the Chinese, now India has one. Italy and Germany have their own. I mean, it's proliferated. But, I think that the meeting that's coming up today will continue this idea that Central Asia, as a region, the 5 countries, have much in common and much to gain by cooperating and integrating more closely. And really what we hope, the United States hopes, is that our meeting with them to talk about those common issues is helping to push them closer together in a sense, or encourage them to start their own thing. And I know, in the years that I was working as the deputy assistant secretary and that was when the C5+1 started. I used to have a lot of conversations with Foreign Minister Kamilov of Uzbekistan, who I referred to earlier, who was, we became good friends, I would say, over the years, and colleagues from having worked together so closely. We used to joke with each other, and I would say, Mr. Minister, what you need is not the C5+1. You need the C5 with no pluses and no minuses. And he laughed and agreed with me. And we still, to this day, he still talks about that. The C5, which is the 5 countries meeting at the presidential level and then trying to institutionalize their cooperation by having ongoing, agreements and so on, is really, that's the goal of all of this, ultimately. I will just add, though, obviously every American administration has its priorities. So I will add that from the Trump administration perspective, I would say they are looking at this as an opportunity to build economic ties that will potentially lead to agreements on things like critical minerals and rare earths, access to the natural resources of Central Asia. And, that's obviously, it's well known that this administration is very transactional in a lot of its international dealings. So I imagine that they're hoping that out of this meeting will come some concrete agreements on, access to certain resources, especially critical minerals, maybe also focus on trade in the region, the corridor, the East-West Trans-Caspian corridor, and building that out as an alternative to other trade routes, and things, economic related deals are likely to be the focus. But the long-term focus, I think, remains that, we hope that such meetings will solidify the cooperation among the Central Asian countries, because the more unified and cooperative they are, the better they can stand up and be sovereign countries vis-a-vis their neighbors to the north and to the east.
And where do you see the region heading in the next decade? Because obviously we've got Russia, which is supposedly losing influence in Central Asia, although we don't really know. Then we've got China, which is strengthening its influence. We've got a still unclear situation with Afghanistan, and the US and Europe trying to get foot in the door. But of course, it's not easy given their geopolitical situation. So where do you see the region heading? If you can make some predictions.
The road to hell is littered with failed predictions that various pundits have made over the years. So I always, I have to always caveat any prediction I make, say that I don't have a crystal ball that's any clearer than anyone else's. However, I will just say that I think the trend that we're seeing in recent years of the Central Asian countries having their own agenda and their own priorities and asserting those internationally is likely to continue and get stronger. And this goes back to what I was saying before about the benefit of cooperating among the five and building out that relationship. So what that means is that, of course, China will continue to grow in its presence. It's a rising power in many respects, especially economically. Of course, Russia will continue to assert its special relationship, you might say, with the region, and its desire to be respected as the former imperial power that still hangs around. So that will continue. But I actually think that, say 10 years from now, we'll look at Central Asia as having strength in and of itself as a region, not just as a route to somewhere else or as a means to an end, right? If you think about the 20 years that the U.S. was in Afghanistan, we often saw the relationship with the five Central Asian countries through the lens of what we wanted in Afghanistan, what we were trying to achieve there, right? I'm sure that if you look at, say Russia and its interests, it's not just the imperial hangover there, but it's also, from Russia's point of view, it's a kind of security thing, right? Central Asia, it's a buffer against, dangerous influences coming up from the south and, fundamentalist Islam, etc. If you look at China, Central Asia is a route to get our goods to Europe. It's a helpful economic development tool to help Western China, Xinjiang, be developed more, to become more prosperous and more stable. That's China's view. So everyone has their own view of Central Asia that is not about Central Asia, but about Central Asia being a means to an end. And I would say, looking ahead in my cloudy crystal ball, I would just say that that will become less and less possible in the future because Central Asia will be standing up for itself and its interests in a more formidable way. So that's my prediction.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It was a pleasure.
Likewise, I enjoyed the conversation very much. I'm sorry. I'm only sorry we didn't have more time because these are really interesting subjects.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.